We all remember the Afghanistan evacuation. Now we are living through the Sudan evacuation. And the question is the evacuation in Sudan about to turn into the evacuation of Afghanistan? Because there are between 9,000 to 16,000 Americans who are still stuck in Sudan. So in this video, we are going to be analyzing the evacuation efforts. What is the U.S. military trying to do? What is the State Department trying to do? And what is the future for the Americans who are still left in Sudan? My name is T-SPLY. Let's get to this video. Now, first and foremost, the evacuation of Afghanistan will probably be one of the biggest black eyes in American history for time to come. The mission wasn't a complete failure, but at the same time, it was a complete failure. We managed to evacuate a ton of people out of Afghanistan, but we backed ourselves into a corner where we were having to work with the enemy. We have U.S. service members who didn't make it back home. We had to send a quick reaction force. We had to send nonprofits to clear routes. That part was the disaster part. And during all of the security briefings from the State Department and the DoD during the whole Afghanistan evacuation, there was this notion of, we have a deadline, we have to get out of there fast. There wasn't a lot of confidence coming from the secretary briefings or any sort of briefing, and a lot of Americans had questions. And at the time, we weren't getting any answers. Nowadays, we are in retrospect, but at the time, we just assumed everything was sort of going okay. But as we all know, that was not the case. However, I will say the United States is really good at learning from its black eyes and learning from its failures. And we can sort of see that in Sudan today. Okay, so we all know that the embassy in Khartoum, Sudan was evacuated. We had U.S. Marines who were evacuated, we had U.S. personnel who were evacuated, and that is typically the first thing you will do when you're leaving a country. That happened in Afghanistan. We evacuated the embassy, and then we started the major evacuation efforts. But the biggest issue is, once you leave your embassy behind, Americans who are stuck in that country, you're sort of on your own, and you better hope America's there to help you. Okay, so now we are back in the same cycle of questioning. We remember in Afghanistan, we evacuated the embassy and we have Americans left behind. Same thing is happening here. In Sudan, we evacuated the embassy, we have Americans left behind. What is the biggest difference? Well, first off, the State Department now recognizes address Americans first. Let them all know, look, we are not there. We are trying to figure it out. Please hide in shelter. Do not come out of shelter yet. We will tell you exactly what to do. And that is sort of the biggest difference, because back during in Afghanistan, they're like, okay, just head to the airport. Everybody come to the airport. The biggest issue, though, if you were trying to get to the airport, there were no secure routes getting to the airport. You had to get through checkpoint, and if the Taliban or whoever was working with the United States at the time found out you were either an American or you were working with the Americans, there was not the highest chance you were even going to be able to make it to the airport. There was a lot of dirty play going on. Okay, so the first thing we need to understand is that the biggest course of action the United States military is trying to do is provide some sort of security route. Initial reports had said that what we want Americans to do is try and make it to Djibouti, and that's where a big U.S. military base is that can act independently, and they can work through Ethiopia to try and secure some sort of route. But now all of a sudden plans are changing. There is a realization that Sudan is a massive country, and just saying, oh, just come over through Ethiopia is not necessarily the easiest thing for the 9,000 to 16,000 Americans. And the reason why that estimate is so big is because the United States doesn't necessarily know how many Americans are in Sudan, because a lot of them just go there and don't report it. So here's the new course of action. Khartoum seems to be the epicenter of where everything is going down. So Khartoum will always be the anchor point and the main point of reference for Americans to look into on what they're going to do. So what the United States allegedly is saying, because, you know, they're not going to tell us everything, but what they are telling Americans is that they want to somehow get a route from Khartoum to the port of Sudan. So mission plans have changed. Instead of going from Khartoum to Djibouti, we're going to try to get them into the port of Sudan, because everything will be internal within Sudan. Now, the port of Sudan is rather isolated. This is not necessarily going to be the easiest or safest journey. Right now, pretty much everywhere in Sudan, you have a risk or higher risk of getting in between some crossfire, having some factions trying to mess with you. This is not only between two major factions of the military leaders and the government. There's also many factions who could get involved. That could also involve some Wagner groups with Russia, but we'll get into that later. But again, for the most part, the new course of action, Americans are being told we are potentially trying to get them to the port of Sudan, and then from there we'll get a contingency group to bring them back to Djibouti. Now, the United States is saying the main way we are trying to figure out these routes and figure out exactly what's going on the ground is, of course, through drones. That's what we're being told. And the main base that is near Sudan right now to get drone efforts out there is Djibouti. And then the next one is all the way over here, which is Niger. So between Niger and Djibouti, we have a rather large spread of American units trying to figure out what exactly we're going to do in Sudan. This is not an easy effort, and that is why whenever you hear of Americans dealing with conflict in Africa, it is very difficult to navigate and very difficult to figure out. We have so many elements of multiple factions trying to mess with the United States. We have outside government groups like Wagner Group, a Russian mercenary group, who they say they're not working in Sudan. They say that we have nothing to do with Sudan, but we have multiple reports of Wagner working with military groups in Sudan. Now, we can't necessarily prove that they're messing with Americans. We just know that could be a threat. Now, as far as comparing Sudan to Afghanistan, this is a completely different situation. What happened in Afghanistan, we sort of backed ourselves in a corner as a nation. There were a lot of people saying President Biden was not as decisive. He didn't make the right calls. U.S. military leaders, the top generals didn't make the right calls. The State Department wasn't even ready for this evacuation. And things look a little more different and things look a little more coordinated through Sudan. We also have to realize in Sudan, we can't necessarily prove that factions are necessarily targeting Americans on purpose. Things were a lot different in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we had Americans who were targeted on purpose. We had people working with Americans who were targeted on purpose. That is not necessarily the case in Sudan. It just so happens there is a very high risk where you could get injured or hurt in a country that the government is not really coordinated really well. Something else to consider, we have no airports in Sudan. The United States military heavily relies on airports within military doctrine for either evacuation efforts, for humanitarian aid efforts, but that is not the case in Sudan because there have been aircraft that have been injured, airports that have been taken out. We have to secure an airport before we can use an airport, which is what we did in Afghanistan. That was the main reason how we were able to evacuate Afghanistan, was through all air efforts. And again, our only airport assets that we could theoretically use is all the way in Djibouti and all the way here in Niger. And that's a major issue because, again, we were working in Sudan. Pretty much every country ever where there are Americans, we have an embassy. But we were not doing military operations in Sudan, so we had no reason to have an airport or create security around an airport. In fact, even in Sudan, we never had the opportunity because factions started to uprise. Things got way too dangerous. There were jets that were getting destroyed, so this was just a red flag. We were not able to do that. It's not like we can't do that, but that's just not in the options right now. Now, as far as mission failures and mission success, I think we are doing everything we can and we're doing everything right. There was no way, shape, or form all of a sudden we could have predicted that everything was going to pop off like it did, and then we ask all these 16,000 to 9,000 Americans to get out of Sudan. Because another thing you have to realize, a lot of the Americans in Sudan, they were also like humanitarian aid workers. They were there to help their families. A lot of people are asking, why are there Americans in Sudan? By the nature of the United States, it's a melting pot of nations from around the world. So obviously you're going to have this unique situation where we have Americans literally in almost every single country in the world because by definition, America being a melting pot, we have nations that melt into America. So this notion of Americans hanging out in Sudan, it's a really dumb notion. In fact, my first lieutenant in the army was from Sudan. So from here, all we can do is analyze and watch what is going on. It does look like the State Department does want to open up a route or try to get some assistance to the Americans. We don't know if that'll necessarily be like boots on the ground. That has been an option that was thrown around, but you already know once you get boots on the ground, it can get into a really dirty situation because factions would love to mess with the United States if they could get the chance, just because a lot of people are not friends with the United States. A lot of people don't like the United States in that region. But as far as boots on the ground, I doubt that'll happen. But judging from what I can see, I don't think this is turning into a whole Afghanistan evacuation. We don't have a timeline. We don't have Americans that are necessarily being targeted on purpose. I will give a little bit of credit to Biden. I know a lot of people hate on him, but his actions, and he was a little more decisive on this one. He said, hey, look, we're getting out now. Obviously, with that, you have the implications of leaving U.S. members and U.S. citizens behind, but What are you going to do? Otherwise, you were going to turn this into another Benghazi situation. You were going to turn this into another U.S. embassy situation in Afghanistan. And the United States and embassies in Africa just is a big issue in general, and I don't think the Biden administration wanted to deal with that. It's very hard to secure those embassies because you're sort of on your own, no matter how many Marines you have. So that's the current situation in Sudan at the time of making this video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Do you think Biden was completely off? Do you think this is another complete effort? Or do you think we are doing everything we can? Leave your comments and opinions down below. Again, I think we are doing everything we can. This is a very difficult situation considering the logistics of the United States military. We can be anywhere we want, but it just so happens in Africa, the one major base that is near Sudan, it's sort of uncomfortably far away. We have a lot of drone assets in the air, but ground assets is not really our thing in Africa. Let me know what you guys think. Comments down below. We'll see you later.